To start this conversation about government funding of the arts, I thought it'd be interesting to kind of put it in the context of the opera in particular, in the Dallas Opera, and kind of talk about exactly where government funding touches the opera, so to speak. I mean, I know only 40% of the, if I have that number right, of the operational funds come from ticket sales. So the rest of that is some mix of philanthropic giving and government-related funding. So
that's absolutely right. So in common with many opera companies these days, less than 40% of the total budget comes from ticket sales, and all of the rest of the amount comes either from endowment draw or from annual giving. Within that annual giving area, by far the largest area of support is individual donors, many of whom are sitting here this evening, so thank you. We also attract a certain level of corporate and foundation support, as well as some government support at different levels. The National Endowment of the Arts has supported some of Dallas Opera's projects, and we receive some local funding as well. But opera in the U.S. is predominantly based on private giving.
And so I know there's a lot of talk lately, both locally, nationally, kind of the debate and climate around the issue of government funding. If that was an equation taken out of the Dallas Opera, how exactly would that kind of manifest? Or would it manifest? Would you have to raise, obviously, the gap there? Or are there any specific programs that are tied specifically to?
I think the symbolism of public funding is very, very important, even if the absolute magnitude of the support is not huge in the whole budget. As a quick digression, I was in Berlin a couple weeks ago and saw some wonderful opera performed at both the Staatsoper and the Deutsche Oper Berlin, and actually saw a performance also of the Berlin Philharmonic. And in that kind of environment, the community is focused around support of the arts being at something like 80 to 85% of the total budget. Here, we're probably much more like 1% at most. But I think having the public backing of these organizations is important because it inspires other donors to say, yes, we have a quality product and we're worth supporting.
Well, that's interesting. One of the things that you hear from the opposite side of the argument, those who oppose government funding, is that the argument is made, at least, that government funding disincentivizes philanthropists. I mean, is that something, Marc, maybe, is that something looking generally, is that a misnomer?
Keith raised some very good points. And speaking nationally, the average for opera companies is that they receive less than 5% of their overall budgets from an aggregation of federal, state, and local support. The federal piece of that has always been the smallest piece of that, so that nationally, certainly, if you round to the nearest percent, the amount that our companies in aggregate get from the federal government is 0% of the operating budget. It is 0.03%. It's very, very small. I just want to put a piece in here that we have to keep in mind that beyond the federal agency, and it's a unique American system, the great support of our federal government for the arts is through the deductibility of charitable gifts. And that donors who elect voluntarily to support the art form of their choice, if they're itemizers, they get to deduct those gifts to whether it's a jazz ensemble or a dance company or an opera company. And I have roughly calculated that the value of the federal subsidy through taxes that are not collected, if you will, the foregone subsidy, is about $100 million a year for opera alone. So the federal government in this country, where any federal policy, whether it's energy policy or whatever, federal policies are not popular in this country. We're a country of individualists, and we like to leave policies up to the states or up to municipalities. So the non-policy policy is that instead of having a big and powerful arts agency, you'll empower the individual donor to act voluntarily through the tax deduction. So that is the unique American system, and it is our life, the importance of that deductibility. What Keith says, I agree with very much, is the fact that there is a federal agency does communicate that the arts matter. The arts matter to healthy communities in a variety of ways that you can articulate better than I. So by having a federal agency, you're sending a signal that says the arts matter, and that then encourages you as individuals to act on behalf of the arts you love.
Well, you mentioned that more of the funding comes from state and local. Veletta, could you talk to the issue now of certain states are eliminating their cultural programs? Kansas was the latest, I think, and the Texas Cultural Trust may be a target in the upcoming session. Is that something we should be concerned about?
Well, I think you should be concerned about it. We'll start with the fact that there was a time when Texas ranked 52nd in what it gave to the arts. Now, we all took geography, and we know there are 50 states, but we ranked behind our American territories in terms of what we gave to the arts in Texas. So by Kansas, and indeed California has substantially reduced theirs, we are not totally at the bottom anymore, but that should give us cold comfort. We were about $7 million collectively, and that's per biennium, so that's a 2-year budget, in the last legislative session, and we're looking at coming down to below probably around $5 million for the arts in Texas. Now, the city, by contrast, does, and this is with substantial cuts, the city of Dallas, by contrast, does about $12.5 million, and that's a substantially reduced budget. I should add that one of the subsidies that the city of Dallas does in many ways, not so much in these buildings that we are currently in, but the city of Dallas owns more buildings than any other city in America, or it's one of the top in terms of the total number of buildings that we own. So municipalities, especially in Dallas, and quite frankly many other states have done this, they invest not only programmatically and educationally, but they have also invested in the actual capital investments. And in Dallas, the building across the street in the form of the City Performing Arts Center, or the City Performance Hall, that's totally publicly funded. Now, these particular buildings, a very small amount. So you get your funding at a city level and in many states by education, programming, and capital funding. But Texas has been particularly parsimonious.
I think it's noteworthy that the support for arts at the public level, for public art support, generally increases as you get closer to home.
Exactly.
So that mayors and city councils are more generous to the arts than our state legislatures, which are more generous than the federal government. One of the challenges for us in the arts sector is to measure the positive outcome of arts activity. How do you know that citizens are healthier, happier, and better? How do you know that businesses relocate here because of the arts community? How do you know that just civic connection is stronger when people experience a great opera sitting 2,000 people elbow to elbow in a theater? I heard as I was coming in when Jennifer was bringing me in that there were simultaneous arts performances around the district last night. And just the spirit in the city last night with all of the audiences intermingling was really wonderful. I think local legislators know that. The mayors see that. The state legislators don't see that as much, and it's very remote from federal policymakers. So one of our challenges is measuring the positive impact of arts activity in the city. We all know it's great. How do we measure it and communicate it? But the local legislators know it.
And it's reasonably easy to measure that economic impact in Americans for the Arts, and certainly the state as well as the city. We're currently in the process of doing an economic impact study specifically for the district and for the city as a whole. But you are exactly right. Measuring that sort of quality of life I think we can say AT&T moved here, and they will tell you they moved here because of an art scene or a growing art scene. But how do we quantify that?
And I think this is a very important point in that it's easy to think of this as a one-sided relationship where state and local governments give money to arts organizations, but in fact, we are a significant driver of economic activity, both in terms of bringing in people for the events and also corporate relocations. to echo what Veletta just said, that in my past life, one of the things I did some work in was corporate relocations. And intriguingly, when companies look at where to move, yes, they look at the quality of the workforce and the cost of living and so forth, but they give an awful lot of weight to the cultural component of the city they're thinking of moving to. And if you were to line up all of those cultural trophies that might attract to corporate headquarters, interestingly, in my experience anyway, symphony performing halls, and in particular opera houses, are recognized as, if you will, the pinnacle of that side of the equation, even among people who may never have been in an opera in their life. And it carries extra weight that it's those kinds of performing arts organizations. When I was at San Francisco, we participated in a number of economic impact studies because in that community there was a big hotel tax, and the opera and the symphony and the ballet all were recipients of some of the benefits of that. And we always would have discussions with the city about, yes, you're contributing some of this money to our operations, but let's also remember that up to 20% of our single ticket revenue came from people from out of town specifically to come see opera, in our case, performances. And I think it's very easy for local governments to, in fact, forget that there's two sides and think of it purely as giving to the arts organizations.